Um, Amy Lansing is a member of the faculty of the University of California, San Diego, in the School of Medicine, Department of Psychiatry. In addition, she is an adjunct professor in the Sociology Department, Division of Criminology at San Diego State University. She holds a PhD in clinical psychology with specializations in neuropsychology, developmental trauma, and forensic epidemiology. Her National Institute of Health and National Institute of Child and Human Development funded translational research program is dedicated to understanding the neurobehavioral underpinnings of high-risk behaviors and functional impairments in undeserved populations, such as juvenile delinquents and maltreated youth. This program integrates neuroscience technologies, imaging and genetics, mental health services, such as treatment for trauma spectrum and drug-alcohol disorders, interventions for violence, and impulsivity reduction. Neuropsychology, criminology, and public policy issues, such as health disparities, HIV, STD, and risk. Dr. Lansing is the current chair of San Diego County Juvenile Justice Commission. Her interest in the JJC stems from the significant number of delinquent youth with cognitive defects and neurological and mental health needs. Dr. Lansing has provided trauma-informed system training, assessed organizational readiness for change, and evaluated the overall climate for public and alternative education school systems across the United States. In this context, she also has engaged in community academic research partnerships to assist agencies in responding to the needs of their communities and students. Welcome, Dr. Lansing.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be here today. I wanted to follow up a little bit with what Tammie was saying earlier about the ACE studies. First of all, because the ACE studies are referenced so much in the literature and there's so much conversation around it, I think it's important that everyone understands that when we talk about those 10 core ACEs, we're actually talking about each ACE as being an event type, meaning that if you've experienced physical abuse, you would get a 1. If you've experienced physical abuse and sexual abuse, you'd get a 2. And there's no reference to severity or frequency. It's just the number of events that have been experienced. So I want to show you what an average classroom looks like in Washington State with sophomores and seniors who were surveyed to determine whether or not and how many ACEs that they had. And in an average classroom of 30 students, we find that only about 20% have no ACEs, and over 63% have 2 or more ACEs. Importantly, there are 33.3% of the youth who have 4 or more ACEs, and that's compared to the original Kaiser Permanente sample that only had about a little over 12% of their participants experiencing 4 or more ACEs. Why is this important? The reason that this is important is that the original ACE studies with the Kaiser Permanente sample really demonstrated that the point at which you've experienced 4 or more ACE-type events in your life during childhood and early development, the greater the probability that you will experience morbidity and mortality, have mental health issues, have medical problems, experience victimization, and even be a perpetrator. The thing to keep in mind about these original ACE studies is that they represented individuals who were already adults, who were health insured, largely Caucasian and middle class, and were working. So this is already a relatively privileged and resilient group. So when we think about our average classroom having over 63% having 2 or more ACEs, we begin to see a picture of what it really looks like in terms of the adversity that are experienced by the youth that we serve. First of all, Washington State is a wealthy state, and these are sophomores and seniors whose parents actually permitted them to participate in the study. I want to draw your attention to one particular finding, which is that over 42% of the youth in an average classroom reported that they were currently experiencing domestic violence or physical abuse. That illustrates that universal precautions really do apply. Nearly half of an average classroom is experiencing severe trauma and adversity on a daily basis. And this is the sort of thing that we have to keep in mind when we try to understand the students that we work with. Again, this is a Washington State, wealthier state, and I want you to take a look now at what it looks like for thinking about delinquent youth. These are individuals who have been engaged in some way in delinquent behaviors enough to gain them the attention of the juvenile justice system. These are youth over 1,000 who were sampled in Florida. None of these youth have had a true finding, meaning that they've been detained but haven't gone to court yet. And you can see that only 3% of boys and less than 2% of girls have no ACE exposure. And on average, boys and girls are nearly at that 4 cutoff point for increased morbidity and mortality that the ACE studies indicate. And again, that's a kind of dose response picture that they're giving you. Importantly, if you look at kids who've been adjudicated, for example, youth that I work with here in San Diego County, 100% of them have 2 or more ACEs. Over 97% have more than 4 ACEs. And 58% have more than 10 ACEs if you include community violence, which is completely missing from the original ACEs, which focus primarily on those kind of family factors. So if we think about what the impact of traditional ACEs are in terms of the patterns that you may be seeing in your own classrooms, the point at which 3 or more adverse events are experienced is the point where we see about 80% of the youth having academic problems, at least 1 or more. So there is a very clear, again, dose-response relationship between the number of ACEs that the youth has been exposed to and the prevalence of academic problems. And so you can see there along the bottom of the slide how it goes from about 34% academic concerns for those with no adverse exposures relative to 80% who have 3 or more ACE exposures. And you see a similar pattern when it comes to looking at developmental delays. These are not disorders, but delays. So at the point at which a youth has 7 hits, basically on ACEs, 100% of them are experiencing developmental delays. I want you to think a bit more deeply about the context of what these different definitions of trauma mean. And so I've provided this slide for you to refer to. Negative stress includes all of the things that Tammie was discussing earlier. These can be things like poverty and prejudice. But ACEs are a subset of that. An even smaller subset of those ACEs are considered traumas. And in order to qualify for a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, you actually have to experience life threat, sexual trauma, or be a first responder, essentially. So that means that we limit access to mental health services by the way we diagnose trauma-related disorders in terms of what kinds of events even qualify as a trauma. Complex trauma, in contrast, are those things that are experienced within the family context, and they do include some of the ACEs like emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse, but they don't include things like community violence, for example. And that set of trauma-related symptoms reflecting complex trauma are considered only for the diagnosis of developmental trauma disorder, which is only under consideration at the moment in the DSM. Basically, when you experience stress, some stress can be positive, but when you experience too much stress, the fight, flight, or freeze response is actually activated, changing a neurochemical cascade, with calm states only being reached once that threat is removed. The problem is, for many of our youth, the threat is never removed. 2 core things to take away from this are that those individuals who are experiencing chronic stress and trauma in that broader sense, not just in the ACE sense, have compromised immune systems, and their frontal lobes are being suppressed on a regular basis. That's critical because it means that they can't learn. Basically, when the frontal lobes are suppressed, problem solving is set aside, and only survival is on the table. And that's what's happening with many of our youth, meaning that they come into the classroom unable to concentrate and learn. Basically, sustained adversity and complex trauma result in affective, cognitive, and behavioral dysregulation. And this is a lot of what you're seeing in your classrooms. They can be hyperarousal, mood swings, attention problems, tantrums, hyperactivity, not necessarily associated with a specific diagnosis, but more as a consequence of the environments that they live in. There are other contributors such as poverty and prejudice, institutional racism, bullying, losses, and sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation alone can produce ACE-like effects, and losses in particular have been related to poor classroom completion of homework, attendance, and disrupted school. In our imaging with early onset persistent delinquent boys who have had multiple disruptive behaviors before the age of 10 and have also been identified by the justice system, we can actually begin to see a pattern that really relates to school problems compared to their controls who come from the same environment, same type of head of household structure. They actually have smaller left hippocampi. And that is because the hippocampus, or not because, but that is important because the hippocampus is critical for verbal learning, which is essential for school performance. It also impacts the areas of language that encroach on the frontal lobe. And we can see that compared to controls, delinquent boys have smaller volumes, they're the ones in red, of the left hippocampus, and then an area of the brain related to verbal abilities as well as the left supramarginal gyrus, which is frontal lobe functioning. That's your abstract reasoning, for example, area. They have worse performance intellectual abilities, worse verbal intellectual abilities. Their brain structures in terms of white matter look very much like youth or adults who are experiencing Alzheimer's, and they have difficulty with auditory processing. This next slide, although busy, is really just showing you that from the top left, these are all the left parts of percularis, which is important for processing verbal information. So what you say to your students is impacted by this area of the brain. Top left-hand corner are loss events. The next one is trauma events. In the middle row, you're seeing grief symptoms, and in the next to it, you see PTSD-type symptoms, and the bottom row shows you the combination of grief and trauma symptoms in response to cumulative trauma, adversity, and grief, not restricted by PTSD definitions or ACEs. And you can see that the larger the number of symptoms that are being experienced, the smaller the pars of percularis is, meaning the more difficulty they have processing verbal information. This means that it's very difficult for them in a classroom context to understand what's being said to them, independent of other symptoms that they may be experiencing. What would happen if we actually looked at the combination of cumulative trauma, adversity, and grief, and developmental trauma disorder symptoms? And what you see here, although complex, is showing you two areas. The first one is surface area of the brain, which tells us something about brain development. And it shows you that in the first or the second column, developmental trauma disorder has significantly more associations with areas of the brain responsible for both language and executive function abilities. So developmental trauma disorder symptoms in response to complex trauma and cumulative trauma, adversity, and grief, the middle column there, both show a high representation in these areas of the brain critical for skills that are needed in the classroom. If you notice the final column with PTSD, there are very few neuroanatomical correlates with PTSD symptoms, which are restricted only to life-threatening kinds of traumatic events. You see the same pattern in folding, which is also another indicator of brain development. So the less surface area and the less folding area of the brain means that you have less ability to process information. This is really critical. What it tells us is that PTSD does not really have much explanatory power, perhaps because it is restricted to only certain types of traumatic events rather than looking at the broader context of negative stress that are experienced and have an impact on development. This actually creates a kind of health disparity. If we restrict access to mental health care on PTSD diagnoses, we're actually missing the entire developmental impact. So if we think about the positive aspects, however, that are still there for us, you can see here in this slide that Sensory pathways come online first, followed by language, followed by those higher cognitive functions. And that's that frontal and prefrontal cortex that I was talking about. Basically, we now know that those areas of the brain are developing well into our 30s. So there's reason for hope. Even though we're maybe working with adolescents, there still can be very important brain changes if they're given a positive environment. I want to make sure that I hit this point, though, when we're talking about having a trauma-informed environment, we are not talking about necessarily providing services, but rather that each of you understands the impact of trauma and broader adversity on the developing brain and how that impacts the student's ability to learn in their environment. That means understanding things like trigger, having suicide response procedures in place, not engaging in passive-aggressive interactions with colleagues, things that may make it difficult for students to learn. So being trauma-informed helps to create a trauma-informed system where you each have each other's backs and not rely on the student's abilities alone to navigate these complex environments. It's important to recognize that triggers that Tammie mentioned earlier are also something that happen with us. We can be triggered by the students as well, or we may have personal characteristics ourselves that trigger students. School itself may be triggering. So it's critical that we take this into consideration when understanding that our students are often in a fight, flight, or freeze mode. So remember, keep calm and check yourself. It's not about you. Seriously, don't personalize. When you stop personalizing a student's behavior, it frees you up to actually be able to engage them in more meaningful learning. And keep in mind that introspection is important. I love this comment. It's all fun and games until someone figures out the function of your behavior. We all have functional behavior. We all have experiences of adversity. And it's important to keep in mind that symptoms that you might see in yourself or others are actually coping strategies. So it's not too late. Delays are not necessarily caps on learning. They can be overcome. Cognitive development continues into your 30s. Relational strategies work for all students. It's important to be authentic in your relationships with students because only when they can trust you can they learn. And you guys are your own best resources. Know that you can tag out, consult each other, rely on each other, and have each other's backs. Trauma-informed practices improve learning for everyone, not only adversity-exposed students. Keep in mind, we're all in this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. We did have a question and a comment in the chat box. Amy, since you're on, I'm going to let you address the comment first. Someone mentioned that it's interesting to see that the 5+ ACEs on one of your graphs shows that a higher number of women compared with men experience that amount, of adverse experiences. Can you speak to that?
Yes, so that is a common finding across all populations that we look at, whether you're looking at resilient populations who are health insured or whether you're talking about youth who are engaged in, say, the child welfare or criminal justice settings. Women do experience higher levels of trauma, and in part this may be due to cultural norms or vulnerability factors, but it is a common finding across populations.
Thank you. Tammie, is there any data showing the impact of discrimination and racism?
So there is research by Janet Helms, and some others who looked at racism and ethno-violence as trauma. And it is one of the references in our references to be shared with you. One of the things that we see with regard to racism and discrimination is that they are likely to occur repetitively and unpredictably. So they do have an extreme adverse effect. The other thing I would say about racism and discrimination with regard to this work, Amy mentioned the ACEs study and how it was normed on a population that is not necessarily the population that you may think of with regard to the extreme number of African American males in particular but African Americans in general who are experiencing suspension and expulsion. So we know that those numbers are disproportionately attached to African American youth, and we know that some of those offenses actually result in the criminalization of youth and their engagement with the juvenile or criminal justice system. When we think about what that means for informing our practices with trauma-sensitive approaches, $53,000 per juvenile is what Louisiana spends to incarcerate a youth per year. And so those monies are certainly monies that could be applied to helping us get up to speed to really support youth in ways that can help them overcome these traumas that may have implications for them across their lives and certainly have implications for us in our lifetime.
Thank you, Tammie.
Welcome.
So we have another couple of questions, and I'm going to let us address these two, and then for the sake of staying on time, we'll ask our presenters to address any other questions either in the chat box or follow-up email. So what policies or systems level changes do either of you see as most needed to move the needle on interrupting the cycle of trauma?
So at the system level, this is Tammie, I think it's imperative that we think about using culturally responsive approaches that take an asset-based perspective when looking at youth and work with youth based on that really cause us to suspend what we think we already know about youngsters and their families and communities, and to imagine the best for them and to continue to support their growth and realizing their potential, as I know is what we plan to do as educators. That's where we all get started. And I think we just have to remember how we got started. So systematically employing initiatives that are culturally responsive, that are restorative in nature, that enable us to really think about the assets in a way that is systematic and that links those to data. And so rather than using data to document and only work toward overcoming deficits, we might look at data to document talents and assets and use those as leverage points to help us, satisfy the needs of children overall and get them to the place where they can overcome any areas of need or any gaps that they may have. Another shift in policy would really be to advocate for a shift in the way monies are spent in mental health capacity. I know that we lost under Governor Jindal an extremely important program for youth age 5 and older that was the mental health program. And we know that Governor Bell Edwards has had to make some severe cuts as well in Medicaid that have affected the number of youth who can get support, but not just, young kids, but all children overall. And so there are restrictions now with regard to eligibility. And so when we vote and when we talk to our legislators, it's really imperative that we push for supporting all of our youth, particularly those who are most vulnerable because of these extreme experiences with trauma.
I agree with that 100%. And I would just also note that if we are really going to be trauma informed, if we're really going to understand that universal precautions apply because adversity is so prevalent, we also have to recognize that verbal abilities are going to be the most impacted. And because of that, we have to think about other ways and other metrics that we use in order to evaluate youth, particularly as they're trying to catch up in terms of their brain development and cognitive capacities. So we should be able to find and identify their strengths and their resiliencies and